And today's session is a session where we try to advance our thinking around what we call an evolving research agenda, and that is a session about infrastructures of inequality. And with this first talk, I will try to explain a little bit what we actually mean with these infrastructures of inequality. And I will also highlight some of the methods we apply to investigate the different flows that basically are the very fabric of these infrastructures of inequality. And then after this initial talk, we will then hear from Forrest Fleischman with a case that really helps to shed light on some aspects of these infrastructures and structural elements. And then we will have Grace talking about and providing another case that really highlights how these flows of finance, flows of biomass, so material flows, immaterial flows, but also financial flows actually shape and create infrastructures of inequality that are persistent through time and landscapes. So, just as a little overview, and I thought before I actually continue with this, I thought it might be useful to explain a bit what we mean and to define what we mean when we talk about social inequality. So this is very much referring to inequality not only within societies, where we very often, especially in the forest literature, we find a lot about elite capture, but here we try to look very explicitly within and across societies in the global north and south, where we look at starting points, opportunities, and also where the finishing lines are all very multidimensional. And we talk about the social inequality where we actually have socio-political processes that actually feed into a machinery that kind of increases the reproduction of those inequalities. And then the next slides I'm using to explain a bit more about what these inequalities are. Actually, this slide is already talking a lot about infrastructures of inequality, because what you see here, for example, is the Northern Borneo British company that got together, and what you can't really see, if you would come a bit closer, you would see that there's also a clear power hierarchy here expressed in this Northern Borneo British company. We have structures, unequal structures in landscapes that are long lines of rubber, with people cultivating and harvesting. Infrastructures can also refer to roads and modes of transportation. Infrastructures of inequality are also very much about power relations. This here is a picture I thought was very fitting for also this conference here, where so much is about the measure pleasure, the numbers that are used. But actually, we have to think also about politics of numbers and the hierarchies that are embedded and the power relations that are embedded in who is deciding what numbers are collected, what is considered important or relevant. So all of these pictures represent parts of what we call the infrastructures of inequality. Infrastructure is basically the foundation upon which a governance structure and economy is built. For example, corn plantations in Westphalia. I'm using this as an example because I'm from a farm in Westphalia 30 years ago, lots of cows, lots of meadows. What we have now are really endless cornfields. So it's really an infrastructure that has emerged in this landscape. Can be oil palm plantations in Indonesia. We can also talk about, I'm living in Finland now, Finnish timber plantations, where you have a conglomerate of really thousands and thousands of smallholders, of individual smallholders, yet the landscape that has emerged is a landscape of one large industrial timber production. Then we have, and I should also say that these conceptualizations that we are using are building very much on work by Wendy Woolford, for example, the plantationocene literature, Donna Haraway, but also Tanya Lee and Simidi, and also Peluso and Van der Geest's work on political forests, and perhaps also Jessica Devine's work with and colleagues who published a recent special issue on this. So basically the infrastructures of inequality are made of physical, that's the oil palm plantation, for example, but also social and political structures and networks through which resources, finance, but also information is exchanged. And when I talk about information, then I'm also talking about ideas, persisting ideas. This morning I was with colleagues in a shifting cultivation session organized by Ole Merz, and I think shifting cultivation is one of these examples where we have really persistent narratives over a local land use that is very much delegitimized through history, through a colonial history. So I'm talking here about information and also ideas that are flowing and that are shaping these landscapes and creating these landscapes and these infrastructures of inequality by being persistent. What also happens in these infrastructures of inequality is very much policy coordination that takes place. Power is executed, and here inequality is then not only produced but also reproduced through interconnected processes that include, as I explained earlier with these pictures, with these photos, including past dependencies and power relations. And I will explain more about that with flows that are material, immaterial, financial flows that are the fabric that hold together these infrastructures of inequality. And what these infrastructures do is not only establishing a structure, but as we will then also show, actually producing silences. There is always something in these infrastructures that is then silenced and is not speak. And we will hear about very strategic silent actors that are part of these infrastructures, but that also stay silent to exploit them. So this is maybe the worst slide I'm having, but that is a little bit how we envision, my colleague Grace and I, this framework for the analysis of infrastructures. We have our flows, we have these networks, institutions, markets, power relations that are constituted through all of this, and the physical structures in these landscapes, but also the histories. Our starting point in this framework is actually very much our own assumptions about how to actually, what are these desired futures, how to break with these infrastructures, and our underlying assumptions and baselines. What we want to achieve with this evolving framework is really to advance our theories and also our methods in understanding what produces and reproduces inequality. So just as an overview, and with that I'm coming to the second part of my presentation. I'm looking at the time, and I have 5 minutes, which is a bit challenging as usual, but I will gallop through these different methods and approaches. So the next few slides are just examples of how we actually try to unpack these infrastructures of inequality. This here is about flows of material, biomass, where we have, for example, one former master student, now PhD student, Hannah Ehrlichmann. She looked at colonial legacies in the German and Cameroonian forest sector and tried to compile and then analyze 140 years of statistics, of timber import-export statistics. We have also work by Ali Seville, another PhD student who really looks at basically scientific knowledge and commercial practices that then legitimize these practices. Flows of finance. This is something where we again look at very much macro level dynamics, historic trade and investment data. But we also look, that was another case study by Niak and colleagues, including ourselves, where we try to look at investments and financial flows in landscapes that then are basically related to REDD+. That was in a landscape in DRC, in the Congo. And we tried to understand with that work with what kind of other land investments REDD+ is actually competing, and is there really space for something like landscape or like REDD+, if you have already long established financial flows within this region at play. And here we look basically at company data, at company histories to understand who is in this landscape. For that work, we used a database called Orbis, and that really helped us to understand company structures. But what I would like to mention here is also that also here politics of numbers are at play, because for the sub-Sahara Africa, it's very hard to find, also in the Orbis data set, much information. So there's also perhaps a strategic silence about what do we know about international investments in these landscapes. So then a little bit about flows of ideas. We investigated flows of ideas very much through a discursive lens. This here is work by Felicity Goldsmith, who looked at also 140 years of indigenous representations in business media. So she basically analyzed articles and filtered, searched for articles in Financial Times, Economist, and I think it's also The Guardian, former Guardian, was actually a financial magazine or newspaper. And she searched for articles in the archive and then analyzed how indigenous people or local land use was actually framed in those. And another approach regarding the ideas, and non-surprisingly I should say, what she found is that today's indigenous representations in these business medias are not that different from what was there 140 years ago. It is still a very, very utilitarian perspective of local land and local people. Another paper by Grace Wong also and others is where we look at the role of science, forest science, but science also in general, in making infrastructures of inequality. So who actually, in these different papers, what we were very much asking is also what role has science played, or did science play actually in the making of and in the legitimization of particular land uses, while at the same time also delegitimizing other land uses, local land uses. Yes, I could talk about each of these papers so much more, but again, the idea is always to find and to investigate and to unpack how structures of inequality are actually produced. Another paper, and maybe that's for this the last example, this was a paper that is actually it's a chapter in a book that should come out any time now. And what we did, this is the paper where we looked actually at coalition building in Sabah around a new land deal that just came out now. And here we used basically DNA, so Philip Leifeld's discourse network analyzer, to understand which actors share what kind of beliefs around a particular carbon deal in Sabah. And we compared also similar study, or conducted a similar study in Cameroon. Last example, flows of ideas, and this is actually one of the more quantitative analysis that we did. This book chapter should come out any time now, and what we did here is we looked at Twitter data, so now it's X, but at that time Twitter data, and we tried to understand coalition building and basically tested a very classic assumption, that's the boomerang effect. If you are a national actor, you're an NGO, you want to produce change, you want to kind of move away from patterns of deforestation, you are very often blocked in your reach of the national government. So as an environmental NGO, what you do, so the theory says, you turn to an international actor, and we see that pattern very often, in the hope that these international actors have more power to put pressure on the domestic government. And this boomerang effect is something we tested here. We used retweet data. So we looked at, basically, we created a roster of more than 300 actors, where we looked at the Twitter accounts of all of the people within these organizations, so that was a lot of work. And then we looked at retweets. So retweet data means you just retweet without commenting, which can be interpreted as an endorsement of what was said before. What we found here, and I think that's very interesting, is that yes, we do have the Forest Watchdog coalition, so we could identify coalitions within this, but more interesting is actually who is in the business as usual coalition, in the, what we call the establishment plus. And what we found here were all the established business as usual actors, oil companies, Shell, BP. But then we also found 3 country actors. Actually, they are development. We had expected that these 3 countries, their foreign offices, would be part of what we call the development industry. But actually, it turned out that these countries, 3 countries, were present in the business as usual coalition. Now you can guess, since this is for DRC, who these 3 countries are. So, non-surprisingly, or perhaps surprisingly, in the establishment were actually China, the US, and the UK were happily endorsing, retweeting business as usual tweets. So, very interesting in itself. I'm running out of time and stealing other people's time, so coming to an end, this was just to demonstrate what kind of methods we can employ, qualitative methods, quantitative methods, to really shed light on infrastructures of inequality over very long time periods. So how do the identified infrastructures actually reproduce inequality? What do our cases tell us? And you will get soon 2 cases that shed a bit more light on that. But what we see from all these case studies is that histories, politics, capital, and material flows are very much reflected in narratives that persist over time. And across these cases, what we see is private sector actors are very quiet. They are in the shadows. But this is also partly enabled through established state and forest regime actors, including also science that legitimizes these acts. And what they all have in common is they all promise development and welfare, but very often at the expense of local people. So the big question, and that's why we work on this framework that we are kind of bombarding you with in this session, is of course that we want to understand how research, also how our research, collective research, can contribute to break and transform these infrastructures of inequality towards a more just future. And we have basically, for us, identified 3 main avenues. The first one is really to question the politics and to dissect the flows, because we need to really shed light on whose interests are served and who benefits within these infrastructures. Another axis is that examining power relations in policies and practices, including commercial practices, that are related to forest access, forest land conversion, but also to trade and finance. And the third axis is really to engage and give voice to those that are very often not heard, not only in policy processes, but I'm afraid that are also not heard in our science that we are producing. So there are also silences and continuous silences. I'm ending here just to highlight that, and that much of this work is based on a Volkswagen grant and on the Fair Frontiers project, which is a Japanese grant led by Grace. So that was the opening talk. And quick, yeah, thank you. Now would come, now I feel a bit awkward because suddenly I'm moderating myself. But is there any urgent question? Yes, Ola has one. Any other question, conceptual question about this? No?
Thank you, Maria. It's very nice to see how all this is coming along. I had one question. In your search for infrastructures of inequality, did you come across any historical infrastructures of equality that could be a learning lesson for the future?
The short answer is, I wish. The longer answer is that even though we did not look explicitly for structures of equality, I think what we see is very often that infrastructures of inequality have replaced structures of equality. So we talk about commons regimes that we see, and this kind of, which also some of the presentations in the past days are, this kind of solidaric and common management has been very much replaced by these structures. And having been part of this shifting cultivation session today, I think this is also a transition that we see there. Sweden systems are built on collective action, on it's a management, or it's a commons regime. And we see also that replaced by individualistic monocultures. So no, and we wish, but what we see is that they are replaced. But I also think, and what you are opening with your question is a question of, is there a place to return to? And should there be? Which I doubt, but maybe that's a question to ask also. So thank you. No other urgent question. We will come back to that later, but if not, then I would say we go to the next speaker. And I'm happy to introduce Forrest Fleischmann. Maybe introduce yourself a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm Forrest Fleischmann, as noted. I'm from the University of Minnesota, and my talk is actually a effort to synthesize work that I realize I actually started doing more than 15 years ago. I didn't know that I was studying forest restoration initially. I thought I was studying something else. But the things that I was studying turned out to all be about forest restoration. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I started just saying that I was studying that. And so this is trying to synthesize a bunch of different pieces of different projects in India. And I was going to give credit also to my postdoc, Pooja, but she didn't come to the session, so maybe we'll take her off the slide, but she did contribute to this. This is all about India, and it's sort of an attempt to synthesize what I've learned across several different projects in India. If you've been to some of the other sessions, you've heard about restoration as a global priority. Pedro Brancalian talked about this in the opening keynote, and there's a lot of big pledges and big funding things happening around restoration, including here in Mexico with a gigantic agroforestry program over the last 6 years, including various programs in India which are similarly large in terms of their funding and potential impact. There's a tendency to talk about restoration as being this sort of obvious win-win, but what we find is that there's often trade-offs. So oftentimes a restored ecosystem might provide better ecosystem services, but you're also taking land that someone was using for something else and making it restoration. And so as I try to fit into the context of this session, I would say that we're often seeing that restoration is creating various inequalities, even as it's sort of marketed as being an effort to sort of provide good things for everybody and we'll all be happy. And I want to point out, because I had to spend last week arguing with a reviewer, well, I didn't get to argue with the reviewer. I wrote something down, and in 3 months we'll hear what the reviewer thinks about what restoration even is. And I am using a very broad definition. In the Indian context, India, as you may know, is extremely densely populated, extremely agriculturally productive. I was very impressed with Meha Jain's talk yesterday, looking at the wheat belt in the Indo-Gangetic Plain and realizing that India is the second largest producer of wheat in the world in a tiny land area that's all tiny smallholder farmers. So India has this very intensive, so when we think about restoring land in India, we're often probably thinking about things like agroforestry and not necessarily sort of recreating whatever native vegetation might have been there in the past. So we need to understand what these trade-offs potentially are, and I came up with a framework to think about this, which is always a risky thing to do. I don't know if I've thought about this well enough to present it, but here's my ideas. So I think that we're seeing several kinds of outcomes, including improved and worsened livelihoods, and places where ecosystems are being improved, and places where maybe they're not being improved, and also changes in what a land produces that I'm very hesitant to make the value judgment of improvement. And I think this is a big problem in restoration discourse, is there's a very normative framework about that the ecologists have brought in about what an ecosystem should look like. And when we look at ecosystems which are very intensively used by people and have been very intensively used for a long time, such as the Valley of Oaxaca where we're sitting, such as, say, Europe or the Yucatan Peninsula or all of India, we have to sort of ask, well, what is the natural vegetation and what does that have to do with people? How did people shape that? We have to ask that even in Minnesota where I live, which does not have the same intensity of historical land use, but where we've increasingly realized that, well, let me put it this way. The glaciers retreated from Minnesota 10,000 years ago, and human beings arrived in Minnesota 10,000 years ago. So there's no forest in North America, or in northern North America, that doesn't have people in it. So I'm going to go through the examples I have of each of these sorts of outcomes that I've written up here. I'm not going to read them on this slide because I'm going to go into them. But I'm thinking about how this all fits together as a framework. So we do have examples in India where restoration increases the provision of valued ecosystem services, and this leads to improvements in livelihoods. And so I mentioned my postdoc Pooja, and some of her doctoral work in central India, she showed that when you move invasive species from the forest, it reduces crop-raiding animals. So you can imagine a mechanism by which that would be happening. Maybe there's better food in the forest when the forest floor is not covered with an invasive species. In my fieldwork in the Himalayas, people tell us, although I haven't been able to really verify it in any scientific way, but I believe them, that increases in forest cover in the upland areas leads to improved dry season stream flow. That's not a totally surprising finding. I've also had people tell me that here in Mexico, the same thing. Restoration of grasslands seems to improve fodder in some areas of India, although there may be a trade-off with fuel wood going on there. So that one might be a little complicated. And I want to point out that some of the key impacts you might expect from improved ecosystem services, like these hydrological flows and pollination impacts from forests for crops, are really not very well studied in India. I haven't been able to find good studies of this, except maybe one or two studies in one or two locales. India is very biodiverse, so we can't necessarily assume they generalize. Restoration can also involve the creation of newly productive ecosystems that are not necessarily ecosystem service-driven productivity, but are direct ecosystem products. So if you saw my postdoc Pooja's presentation earlier today, you saw the same graph. This is from a systematic review that we're working on agroforestry and livelihood impacts. And you probably can't read all the small print, but the basic idea is all these green bars are places where agroforestry has a lot of benefits. And basically every kind of intervention, every kind of outcome we looked at, most of the outcomes that were measured in the literature, I think there's some publication bias going on, but most of the outcomes that were measured in the literature are very positive. So agroforestry crops seem to be a really potentially very beneficial outcome. But in the Western Himalayas where we work, farmers also tell us that restoration is bad for farming, because restoration near farm fields provides habitat for these cute-looking monkeys that come and eat everything. So communities actually sometimes oppose restoration projects and fight to not have restoration projects because, and we've also heard accounts of people actually completely abandoning their fields because they feel like they can no longer produce anything in them because there's such a heavy density of monkeys in the neighboring restored forests. And restoration sometimes means taking land out of one productive ecosystem and using it for restoration, but taking it out of some use that other people are using it for. So we have documented in the Himalayas that grasslands that pastoralists use are being replaced by forests for restoration purposes with negative impacts on their livelihoods. And Laura Valencia has published a paper looking in eastern India showing that sometimes it's actually restoring, like actually villages are being removed to do restoration. So that's a very negative potential outcome. So overall, we see different pathways leading to different kinds of outcomes with different kinds of implications for people. And some of these outcomes seem really wonderful, and some of them seem kind of not that good, or at least we should be recognizing that we're creating some pretty strong trade-offs between different values we have in the landscape. And I think in my work, I don't feel like I have a good handle on why we're getting these different outcomes. But an overall pattern I see is that there are a bunch of top-down initiatives that are having pretty negative outcomes frequently. And there's also a lot of very bottom-up restoration kinds of activities, typically on private land. So you mentioned common land being a source of equality, but I think we're even seeing that on private lands where people are taking autonomous action or with some state support but are enabled to do what they think is best on their land, we're seeing better outcomes. Although inequality is not measured very well in some of those studies. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm taking some questions. So.
Hi. So, Forest, thanks. So thanks, Forrest, for that review. Just at the very tail end of your presentation, you mentioned the top-down, bottom-up difference. So, but I was hoping you would then come to the crux of the matter, which is the governance and rights questions. The outcomes will depend upon who controls the decision-making on what action to take. And I wouldn't even call smallholders planting trees as restoration. If they do it because they benefit from it, they're just doing a different land use. I mean, trying to package it as restoration itself is a dangerous action.
Thank you, Sharat. I collect a second.
Thanks, Forrest. I guess my question is kind of related to that. The top-down initiatives that you spoke about, are they kind of government afforestation initiatives? And do you think there's any like political like reasons behind the targeting to these certain areas. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, so certainly the rights and tenure regimes are really important in driving these outcomes. So I agree with you. And that's probably something I should have said. So I think you said it very nicely. And I think there's a whole problem with using the word restoration. And I think I would say what I'm thinking right now is if the government wants to do restoration, let's have them encourage smallholder farmers to plant trees on their land that they already want to plant, as opposed to what we've been studying in the Himalayas, where they plant trees where there are already forests because someone's giving them money to plant trees, and they're just planting more trees in the same places where they already are, which is just, I mean, literally it's like digging holes and filling them in again. Like, I don't know why they bother. Katie, as to your point, what we see, what we think is going on is money is flowing into restoration and the government doesn't have places to put it. So in Himachal Pradesh, where we've done a lot of work, I think our view is there are not good places left in the state to restore forests on government forest land. And so they're getting money to do it. And I can tell you some funny stories, but that'll take a little longer. But they're getting money to do it. And so they just do stuff. They dig holes and fill them in again because someone's giving them money for that. And I think it's a complete waste of time. But they took down my slides. But the orange bars in our literature review where there were negative outcomes are heavily correlated with those. It's basically all in those government-led top-down programs. So that are happening mostly on government land. Community lands taken over by government. Certainly.
Okay, thank you very much, Forrest. When we go to moving to the next presentation, perhaps one more thought about flows, since you mentioned flows, financial flows coming into a landscape and producing infrastructures of inequality. At the same time, we also have biomass floating out and perhaps then supporting an energy transition elsewhere. So there are lots of where are these forests and this timber then is going. But without any further ado, over to Grace Wong and her case study.
Right, thank you, Maria. My talk, it takes us to a slightly different part of the world in northern Laos. And this is an area that is really changing very quickly. It was largely at one point in the recent past, probably 15 years ago or so, largely dominated by shifting cultivation, but now is really a big commercial landscape of boom crops. So these are all my co-authors, largely from the National University of Laos. So we talked about infrastructures, and I just wanted to say that the government of Laos, of course, is in itself infrastructure, an institutional infrastructure. It's a socialist government or one-party government, and it puts up posters like this where we are all developing together to further the economy of Laos or development in Laos. But also in days, this is also next to a very market-driven form of economy, and they actually call it the socialist market economy, so we can all develop socialist market economy. So this kind of lends a little bit the thinking, because if you're a socialist government, a one-party government, development is also directed a certain way, following a certain vision and ideology. So I just wanted to put up one of the key policy or programs, which is the Turning Land into Capital program, which has existed now for the last 20 plus years, which really through a series of different institutions, laws, national strategies to kind of enable large-scale land concessions as part of the drive towards economic growth. And so in the area where we work, in these frontiers, other people have also studied some of these areas, and they always talk about how frontier regions, particularly this study is from Laos and Myanmar, they are supported by certain power relations that integrate comparative supply advantages, low land rent, labor prices, and informality to meet this increasing demand for crops, and this is actually what we find also. So this is where we do our research. We have a cluster of 3 villages here and a cluster of 3 villages here, just very close up north to China. This is the Lao-China Railway that was completed maybe 5-6 years ago, I guess. So in our villages here, this is just about 8 kilometers to the border of China. So this is kind of a really fast developing landscape. And so this is the kind of image that Laos wants to show you. It's very modern. We are building infrastructure, and so infrastructure is also physical, right? It's not just kind of everything that we talked about. So this is not only to move people, but it's also to move commodities and to move crop products. But these are the landscapes where we work. So there's been a lot of conversion, to kind of, basically this is a hill of corn. And so these are all small holders. These are not large holders, but these are small holders driven by a certain type of investment and a certain type of flow of finance that kind of creates these practices. These are, rubber, watermelon, and more rubber along the way. Okay. All right, so in the approach, we adapt a telecoupling approach, really to examine how frontier changes are driven, as we know, not only by local behavior and policy, but also global, local flows of ideas, capital, commodities, and expertise along the lines of what Maria has talked about. But we know that flows is only one part of the picture. There are also histories, structures, networks, and so on. So we want to examine both the place-based as well as the flow-based processes that is in these spaces and the network relations of actors. So these are our 2 research questions around flows of finance and ideas particularly, and how these flows are operationalized on the ground. Okay, this is just our data collection. We've been collecting data. So this is very recent work over the past year and a half or so. So the basic methods, which we all do, focus group discussions, transit walks, household surveys, and so on. But for this particular study, we focused on interviews with the Chinese traders and companies that are in the place, as well as the local, district, provincial government officers. And we, amongst all the questions we asked, we also wanted to get their ideas of what they see as desired futures for whether it's their business or the land or the people. So what we find is that one district officer say foreign companies here are 95% Chinese, 5% Lao. But what we find is that the Chinese companies are very diverse and very heterogeneous. So they are export trading firms, investment companies. They are financed by Chinese development banks. They are financed by networks of individual investors where they create, actually they go out and find these networks of investors. So they will say something like, this year we had 20 investors so we can develop our crops on 400 hectares of land, but next year we might get more. So it's kind of very fluid and very adaptive. A lot of the smaller companies actually have contracts with large Chinese companies who have negotiated quotas with the Lao government. So as part of this enabling investment, the large Chinese company then find these smaller trading firms to go out and create little projects to meet their quota. Because if they don't meet their quota, it means also they're not contributing to Lao development, which then they might lose their quota for the next years. So there's a lot of pressure. Many of the companies are small, 4 to 10 employees. Only one that we've interviewed actually had a processing firm. But they bring in all Chinese agricultural experts. So there is, is a very dominant practice, very, in a sense, a certain type of technologies that are brought. There is also a lot of fear of bankruptcy, a lot of fear of complexities. There's a lot of competition among these companies. So it's all really interesting, and we're just kind of trying to get into this a little bit. But everybody has plans to expand, so there is no question about that. So what I wanted to go into this a little bit is that the crops and farming models are very diverse as well. In this watermelon cultivation is through land leases from farmers, but then the farmers are often rehired as laborers as well. And one of the farmers said that because of the use of chemicals, the land is often not productive, and the only use is to let grass grow for his cattle. So it's really so they know this, but they're still leasing the land because that's one way of getting basically cash into as the economy is becoming more and more cash driven. Soybeans is planted on paddy lands after the harvest of paddy. So in between, so it's very short seasons and it's very distinct. Okay, I gotta go quick. Sugarcane and corn are involved mostly contract farming, where the Chinese company provides the three, which is the technology, seeds, and market, and the local farmer provides land and labor. But because the seeds are often genetically modified, so with seeds come also pesticides and a certain type of technologies that are in place. In fact, many of the companies pay the farmers in Chinese currency, where they have banks in China. So they don't even have a Lao structure. So it's all really based back in China. So I just want to say the choice of crops are very highly responsive to market demands, a certain level of uncertainty every year for the farmer. And there are also increasing seasonal labor from neighboring provinces, which is in our interviews talked about as a good thing, because you're generating employment and jobs, and people are earning money, so it's a good thing. Okay, the provincial government is also one group provincial district governments, one group that we interviewed. They focus on promoting, facilitating, monitoring investments. There's also the perception that people need to be mobilized. They don't really know how to make decisions. They should follow the rules set by the Chinese companies. Chinese companies are highly technological, high investment values. But a lot of the farmers we talked to also embrace the investments, because the history of failure of government projects, which are often development aid projects in Laos, so you have your alternative livelihoods, have largely not supported local well-being. So they're like, well, that didn't really work so well. Here's a new actor. Let's go with them and see how it goes. So there's been a lot of willingness to kind of join these schemes. Okay, when we ask people about their future, the future is very tied very much to the economy. And the Chinese companies see themselves as really contributing to positive change in the region, where they are generating jobs, people are improving their level of standard of living, they're also paying taxes to the state, And they talk a lot about green, and what I discovered, green is just that, you know, when the rice is harvested and the land is bare, you plant soybeans, it's physically green. So it's nothing to do with sustainability or anything like that. But the government actors also look at investments surprisingly as equitable. Because like if you bring more income, everybody's living well, the relationship between poor and rich are closer together. So it's a very interesting concept, perhaps needs some thinking of what they all mean. Okay, some insights. I think that my interpretation is that the state actors position themselves as we are at the frontier and we are marginal and we need investments to pull us up and above, you know, and develop. So they kind of talk about we are in this mountainous region, we are so remote, we have no infrastructure, we need Chinese investments. Everybody that we talk to recognizes the trade-offs with loss of forests, increasing environmental health impacts, but it's always seen as it's necessary. We need to monitor better, but this is kind of necessary for growth. There is also growing concerns about food security because everyone is growing all these crops. For the Chinese market, there's food crops is actually declining massively. And in the two provinces that we work in, a certain level of imports of food are coming from China and also from Thailand. And I just want to say that from the local farmers' side, they are also looking for cash income. They are also looking for cash and money as a form of local well-being in their definition of local well-being. And although they recognize other forms of things, it is not prioritized or less prioritized at the moment. Okay, so I think that's really what we are finding, and I think it fits, I think, when we talk about flows, whether it's capital, how they're playing on the ground, and I think the systemic infrastructure of the state institutions is also kind of reinforcing what we might think as inequality, but what everybody else might not perceive as inequality. And this is our research team in the field. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grace. Questions? Esteban, any other?
Wong, thank you so much for the presentation. It was very, very inspiring. I don't know, I've never been there, so it's been also very illuminating. I have a question. Let's imagine a science fiction scenario where we have this global conservation NGO that is able to raise, let's say, millions or billions of dollars and goes to this region and says, look, I'm going to give you money and what I'm asking in exchange is that you conserve your forests and you reinforce some kind of sustainable agriculture that it's more locally focused, short circuits for marketing. So in this scenario, what would be a better infrastructure? What we have at the moment, or these other sort of conservation, agroecology, top-down vision?
Thank you. I think Julie Zeringer could answer that because that's what she works on in conservation and not just the other side of the mountain in northern Laos, and how has the conservation infrastructure worked. But one problem with that is that forest is state land. Forest is not local people's land. So you do have to, establish this kind of structure that hampers possibilities. And these kinds of alternative agroecology things are in play, or have been in place, or have been tried, and everyone says, oh, we got the project with the 10 chickens and the 20 ducks and the alternative livelihood for conservation, and it's not they ate all the chickens, they said. So, I mean, it's a joke. But I think it's a lot of challenges in that sense.
First Julie, then you. But yeah.
Thanks a lot. I'm not going to answer to your question. I have a very difficult one myself. I think, as you know well, Grace, we've also worked in even this district, Viengpoka, and neighboring districts before. And I think like the resource we're talking about here is really soil. So basically these investors are after this resource of fertile soils. And we also know that through these types of production, these soils in a few years, they will be completely depleted. So all these investments will have to move on to a different place and will basically be left with all these wastelands. So, I mean, there are really these short-term massive economic gains, but yeah, I think none of us really has an answer to this, but what comes after? I mean, what does the future look like for these people and their agricultural land?
And I would say, to add to that, all of that in a context where shifting cultivation, that we do know is a sustainable land use and a local agricultural practice, is illegal. So who is questioning the sustainability of these?
Okay. Thanks, Julie. Yes, and I think the farmers know that. They say that, and what we are thinking is in that is this new investments that are coming into wind farming, solar energy farms, and we've been we get this information and the hectareage that's involved, and we always think, how is that going to happen? If this happens and that happens, there's no space for anyone left. But then that's actually, I think, what is emerging. This is my personal suspicion. So it's the next wave is into no longer into land, but into renewable energy.
And again, the question, renewable energy for whom? So whose energy transition from fossil fuels to non-fossil fuels is supported? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe this is somewhat similar to the other questions, but I was thinking about the conversation this morning in the plenary, which related to the idea of, do people want to have sustainable rural livelihoods, or do people want cash and moving to the city, and what's driving that? And I guess I was wondering how that relates to this landscape, because you're saying, well, these farmers know they're doing something unsustainable, but they need cash. Is that because they're desperate, or is that because they have an aspiration to something that's not a rural livelihood? Is that a false consciousness, or is that a genuine? So you talked to all these people, I'm curious what you saw there.
I think the aspirations are very diverse. It's not that everybody wants this kind of landscapes, but the ones that do, it's always about the next generation. I want to send my kid to school. Lao only very recently graduated from least developed country status. So a lot of those basic infrastructures that we take for granted, schooling, healthcare, doesn't really exist. Particularly in these rural places. So I think that's this aspiration that's needed, and that's something that you need money for. On the other hand, there are also, of course, things that we're trying to tease out about relational values and what they, because one of our research area is within a protected forest, and one is just basic agriculture lands. So trying to understand relational values and what they mean and how might different aspirations come into play is something that we are working on. So, our data collection only ended in July, so we're still sifting through things.
These are conversations I have actually with my cousins in Westphalia who are also all farmers, and I wonder about cognitive dissonance, and it's very interesting to have these kind of conversations. But conversation is a key word, because we would like you to have conversations with each other right now, and if you don't mind, we would like you to discuss in small groups, like 2, 3, 4 people. Just go together with your neighbors, ideally not with people you hang out every day with. I see some lumps of people that know each other far too well. But maybe run around, find other buddies to talk to. We would like you to talk about 2 things or 2 questions. One is, and as I said, we also want to pick your brain about this whole framework. One thing is, you have listened now to 3 talks. What was for you really surprising, if anything at all? Maybe in your group discussion you come up with, this was yawn, nothing new, because we have seen it all. So what was surprising for you, if anything? And the second question we have to you, and we would like you to discuss in your small groups, is what are the gaps that you did not see covered here? What should be covered? What are questions that should be asked within the thinking of infrastructures of inequality? So go ahead and talk to your neighbors. We will then do a little round afterwards to, don't run it, yeah, it's a classic, people run away when they have to talk to each other. But for those interested, talk quickly to your neighbors and then we go around and hear what you came up with.